Well, at this point in my life, I consider myself an outlander. I have been in Stamford, Connecticut since 1996, and I really can't imagine living anywhere else at this point. But I wanted to ask you guys in advance to forgive me if an accent comes out when I'm telling the story, because this story does tend to bring me back to my roots a little bit. I was born and raised in Charleston, West Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia. And my whole family, in fact, actually hails from that general neck of the woods. My father is from the Uniontown, Pittsburgh area, go Steelers. And my mother is from rural Ohio. She grew up in the area of Springfield, Ohio, and the tiny little town called Ada, which is in Hardin County, Ohio. Now, there were a lot of good stories that came out of my mother's years growing up in rural Ohio there, but a lot of the ones that I like best always seem to center around a fellow named Frenchy. Now, when my mother knew of him, Theodore Frenchy Laurent was already an older gentleman. He was considered a bit odd by some of the folks in town, but that was mostly because of circumstances that just always seemed to find Frenchy through no real fault of his own, in my opinion anyway. But he was also very well liked and very well respected in the town. He was a veteran. He had served in the Spanish-American War. He had served with the 1st Ohio Volunteer Artillery Corps. Now again, there were folks that said not all of Frenchy ever came back from that war. They were right literally, at least, if not figuratively. For you see, Frenchy had been involved in a freak battle accident where he had lost one of his little toes. And it was involving a runaway cannon that had got him with his little toe there. And at that point, the Army decided he was no good for marching anymore, so they sent him home, and that cost Frenchy a shot at lasting military glory. But when he got back to Ada, he stayed active in the town. He joined the new VFW, then he joined the moose, the elks, the buffalo, any other large hairy animal that had lodged that he could find. And then he was active in a couple of town committees, and he was also a member of the color guard. He marched in every parade following the town's marching band. Didn't matter whether it was the 4th of July, Veterans Day, Thanksgiving, what have you. Nobody wanted to go home until Frenchy marched by holding some kind of flag. So at any rate, there were a lot of good stories that I heard about Frenchy, and most of them I heard from my now dearly departed great Aunt Gladys Reed. Now, when we kids were little, we would go to Aunt Glad's house in the summers. And we would spend about a week there, and we'd stay in her guest room. There in her guest room, she had a chest of drawers, and in the very bottom drawer, she kept old bags and hats and scarves and ties and things that we kids would use to play dress up. Now one day, in the very back, in the bottom of that drawer, I found an old sheet. It was a perfectly ordinary white cotton sheet. But it had strange scorch marks and burn holes in it. I was curious, so I took it to Aunt Glad and I said, "What's up with the sheet?" Well, she laughed and she smiled. And she said, "That there is the very sheet of the devil bear of Ada itself." Well, I sat back, because I knew Aunt Glad was always up for a good story. It seems a while back, when she was younger and she owned a property in Ada, there had been some strange sightings in the town. One person reported seeing a black bear in their backyard one night. And the next night, someone reported seeing a black bear rummaging around in the dumpster behind their store in the alley. Well, it soon got to be more and more sightings of a bear around town. And every time someone told the story about it, it got to be bigger and meaner, of course. Got to the point where the younger boys in town were talking about a devil bear that was prowling around the streets of Ada at night with horrid black matted fur and fire and shot from its eye sockets. Everybody knew these stories had to be ridiculous, but it didn't mean that people weren't getting a little bit afraid to go out at night. So, the trouble with the whole thing, though, was that there hadn't actually been any bear in the area of Ohio since the days of the settlers. The closest anybody had actually ever really been to a black bear was at Edna's Way Out Cafe. See, Edna and her husband Charlie, they'd been running the Way Out Cafe on the way out of town for about 20 to 25 years. It stood in a quiet spot on the road on the edge of town. There was no real neighbors anywhere near, just trees on the one side of the road, and then on the other side of the road where the diner was, there was just empty fields. Well, one day, Charlie and her husband had gotten it into his head that he was going to go rummaging around in some antique stores and some flea markets, and he came across a large stuffed black bear. Now this particular bear had been taxidermied standing full upright, and it had its claws out in front of it, and a vicious snarl on its face. It stood nearly 6.5 to 7 feet tall. It was a mean-looking cuss. So when he brought it back, Edna was more than a little dismayed, and she wouldn't let it in the diner. So instead, he built a pedestal, and he set it up on the pedestal out in the parking lot in front of the diner, facing out towards the street. Folks seemed to like him standing there, so slowly Edna settled into the idea. But she insisted twice a year she would go out and she would douse him down with some good turpentine to kill the bugs that were crawling in his fur. That actually seemed to work pretty well, except for the fact that, for a couple of days after, once in the spring and once in the fall, a couple of days after that, the customers would complain about the smell a little bit until it kind of evaporated off. But anyway, I digress. So everybody in town really kind of knew that these stories of bear had to be basically nonsense. But there were enough calls and complaints and reports coming into the mayor's office that he decided to hold a town meeting. Well, since no one had ever seen a black bear before, no one had any idea what to do about one. And so the meeting was getting a little raucous. People were shouting over each other and discussing. Well, in the middle of all the particular fuss, one man stood up and he volunteered to go and get that bear. That was Frenchy and Well, the trouble was that a few years back, you remember I told you that he was an artilleryman in the war. Well, a couple of years back in the summer, they had held a concert at the 1812 Overture. And Frenchy had been allowed to shoot off the cannon once, at the very end. The cannon that stood in the Veterans Park there, he had been allowed to shoot off the cannon once at the very end of the concert, and due to circumstances totally beyond his control, he had accidentally blown the roof off the gazebo where the band was performing. So everybody wasn't exactly convinced they trusted Frenchy to go out to the woods armed for bear. But nonetheless, he was a trained military man, so it was agreed that they would let Frenchy go out as part of a party to look for the bear. Now, everyone assumed that somebody in the party ought to really know what they were doing. So they called upon the services of David Fuchs. Now, David was the local animal wildlife control officer. Now, the truth is, he had never handled anything bigger than a bull terrier, but nonetheless, he was unanimously appointed to the party. Now, the other man that they asked to go was Ralph Beater. Now, Ralph was asked partly because he was an avid hunter of duck and squirrel, but mostly he was asked because he had a vehicle that could handle the more rural roads of the county. Ralph's truck was known as Old Beulah. Well, to Ralph. The rest of the town had less savory and less family-friendly names. You see, she was a beauty in her day. She was a 1937 GMC T14 with bug-eyed headlights, running boards, and a deep green paint job. But over the years, she had developed a few personality quirks. You see, she wouldn't start out without a deafening backfire of sparks coming out of the tailpipe. And when she did come on, the radio that Ralph had hot-wired into the console would come on blaring some random radio station at full volume. But Ralph knew how to fiddle with the knobs on the radio to get it to turn off, and he loved driving that truck. Now, on the night they were going to go out looking for the bear, Frenchy was assigned to perimeter patrol. So he went out to the outskirts of town, and he started marching around in the neighborhoods up on the edges of town, where the bear sightings had kind of started and where most of them had been. The other two boys, they got into the cab of Old Beulah. Ralph stuck the key in and turned her over. Bang! Right set of sparks erupted from the tailpipe. And the radio came on blaring, Earth Angel, will you be mine, my darling dear, love you all the time. Well, Dave and Ralph exchanged a few sheepish glances at one another, and then, with a little blush on their face, they turned the radio knob off, and they drove on off down the road. They were headed in the direction of the local animal wildlife preserve, because they figured perhaps something was in that area and kind of had been flushed out, and maybe that was now what was roaming around in the back streets of Ada somewhere. Now, the forecast for that night was for a very unseasonably cold fall evening. So, in addition to their flashlights and their rifles, the boys had gotten a hold of a couple of thermoses to hold some hot coffee, and they'd also got 2 U.S. Army surplus field parkins. Now, these parkins had thick, fur-lined hoods, and they looked completely ridiculous. But, somehow the military gear felt right for the occasion. So anyway, they got into Beulah, and they were driving on down the road. They stopped at Edna's on the way out of town. They had a couple of cups of the high-test sludge that Edna referred to as coffee. And then they filled up their thermoses with some more, and they headed back out into the night after helping her close down the joint. They got back out of the car. Ralph stuck the key in and turned her over. Bang! A bright set of sparks erupted from the tailpipe, and the radio came on blaring, "Only you can work this change in me. Only you, for you are my destiny." Well, Dave and Ralph again exchanged a few sheepish glances at one another, and Ralph could have sworn Dave batted an eyelid. Then turned the radio off and then drove on off down the road. When they got about to the area where the Animal Wildlife Reserve was, they pulled the truck off to the side of the road there, parked, and they got out. It was now fully dark, and it was quite cold. So they zipped up their parkers, they pulled up their hoods, got their flashlights and their rifles out of the back. And then they headed off into the woods. And they were trying to be as quiet, as careful as 2 completely untrained and highly caffeinated men could manage. Didn't work so well. But after several hours of blundering around in the dark and having absolutely nothing happen other than the fact that they would occasionally scare each other when one of their stomachs would growl from the caffeine, or they'd step on a twig or something, they gave up. They decided that surely anything that was out here had already been in the back streets of Ada by now and was roaming around somewhere there. Frenchy had to be having better luck, so they decided to head back to the truck. But on the way back to the truck, a deep, dense fog started to settle in over the area. Got to the point where even with their flashlights, by the time they got back to the truck, they couldn't see 50 feet in front of them. By the time they got back there, they wearily threw their gear into the back bed of Beulah and climbed on into the cab. Ralph stuck the key in and turned her over. Bang! The bright set of sparks erupted from the tailpipe, and the radio came on blaring, "The more I learn to care for you, the more we drift apart. Why can't I ease your lonely mind and melt your cold, cold heart?" Well, this time, Ralph didn't care what Dave was looking like. He just bashed on the knobs and turned off the radio real quick. They drove on off down the road. Ralph had to concentrate really hard on the road anyway. He couldn't see where he was going practically. It was so foggy, so dark, neither one of them had any idea where they were on the road. And everything looked so eerie and unfamiliar and strange. Just then, as they were coming up around one curve, Ralph saw something out of the corner of his eye. It looked like a black, hairy shape. Just as the truck's headlights were coming up around a curve, he saw it caught in the headlights. Just for a second, it threw a giant shadow of the thing up onto the fog behind it. It turned and looked at them, and just for an instant, those fiery red eyes caught in the headlights and were staring back at them. Well, but no sooner had they seen it than it dashed across the road right in front of the truck. Ralph had to spin the wheel hard, and just to avoid hitting it, he sent Beulah into a shuddering, screeching skid until finally it got to come to a halt, pointed straight across the road back into the trees into which the thing had disappeared. Well, it was so dark, so quiet, so foggy, neither one of them had any idea they'd made it all the way back to the edge of town. And they were now sitting right outside the parking lot of Everyman's. What was that? Said Ralph. I don't know, said Dave. But let's get the guns out of the back. On a count of 3, ready? 1, 2. But he didn't even get out the word 3, for no sooner had he thought the word, then right back out of the trees came that big black hairy shape. It was pounding out of the fog at them, with those big glowing fiery red eyes staring right at them. Ralph panicked. He flew it in reverse and floored it straight backwards. But the thing was gaining on him with every stride, and then suddenly, bam! Beulah struck something from behind and stalled out. but the devil bear didn't even break stride. It just jumped right up onto the hood of the truck, right up over the cab, and disappeared into the night behind them. Well, Ralph shakily grabbed the keys and he tried to turn Beulah over again. Come on, Beulah. Come on, Beulah. Bang! The radio's bright sparks erupted from the tailpipe, and the radio came on blaring. Ralph chanced a glance into the rearview mirror. His worst fears were confirmed, for there, illuminated by the red glow of Beulah's taillights, was a gigantic black bear. It had its claws out in front of it, and a vicious snarl on its face, and it stood nearly 6.5 to 7 feet tall, and it seemed to be leaning ever closer in of the truck. They were so close they could smell the very brimstone of the devil. Smelled a lot like turpentine for some reason. What was worse, now there were flames beginning to come up over the bottom half of the bear. Well, Ralph wasted no more time. He threw it to first and floored it, peeling out the tires back out onto the road. But the devil bear had gotten a hold of the back bed, and it wasn't let go. Well, Ralph panicked. He spun the wheel to the right and the left, trying to shake himself for the bear. But it was no use. The devil bear had a tight hold, and now she was beginning to bash her head and her claws against the back window of the cab of the truck. And there were flames engulfing the entire body of the bear. Ralph didn't know what to do. In one last desperate attempt to free himself of the bear, he spun the wheel hard to the right, and he plowed right off through the backyards of the houses on the outskirts of town. Well, but now there were bushes and trees and bird baths and bicycles looming up out of the fog at them. But Beulah, she faithfully dodged them all with her radio blaring. But now all of a sudden there was a tool shed in front of him. Ralph spun the wheel hard to the left, and he plowed right through a long line of sheets that had been left out, hanging out to dry overnight. The sheets wrapped themselves all around Beulah, blinding Dave and Ralph completely as they plowed on off through the backyards of town. Well, you remember Frenchy was out marching around. Frenchy heard a big commotion coming from off to the side. He ran over that way to see what was going on. When he got there, this is what he saw. There, coming out of the mist and the fog, was a gigantic, flaming black bear standing in the back bed of a pickup truck that was wrapped in glowing, ghostly white shards of burial cloth. And in the cab there were these two smaller figures, each wrapped in horrid black matted fur. And they were screaming their deathly banshee wails. And there was music blaring into the night. Bom, 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 bom. Frenchy had two thoughts that went right through his mind. He said, by God, the devil bear is a mother. And bears can drive trucks. Well, then he snapped back to attention. He leveled the rifle at that thing. He took careful aim at the truck and took careful aim right at the center of the truck, just despite the fact that the thing was bearing down right at him. Then blam! Pulled the trigger. The truck swerved off to the right, struck a tree, the lights went out, the engine died, and everything was quiet. Frenchy stood there a moment, looking as the body of that bear toppled over and landed into the back side of the truck. He watched the last few flames sputter out on the body of the bear. And then just then, out from the mist and the fog, came trotting a great big black dog. It was a Newfoundland dog. And he came barking and yapping and running over to the truck as if it was having the best time of its life. He came right over to the truck and started scratching at the doors and wagging his tail and barking. Well, Dave and Ralph were so dazed and confused, they had no idea what was going on. They just opened the doors and flopped out into the grass on either side of the truck. The dog ran from one to the other, yapping and licking them up down in the face, trying to get everybody to play. Well, after that, it took a little while, a couple days, in fact, to sort through all of the various eyewitness accounts of that evening's festivities. But no sooner had Dave looked down and seen the collar of that dog, and he realized that it was a stray from the next town over, and most of the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. You see, that big dog had been reported missing almost exactly the same time as all the bear sightings had begun in England. And if you've ever seen a Newfoundland, you can understand the mistake. And if you haven't, come look up the picture. Anyway, Dave and Ralph, they survived with hardly a scratch on them. But Beulah, she needed a new paint job, new headlights, and a new fender. But Frenchy's bullet had lodged somewhere deep inside the engine block and seemed to cure her of her backfiring problems. That was considered a plus. As for Charlie and Edna, they never did replace the bear that had been standing outside the Way Out Cafe. Edna put her foot down. She said it was way too wild for her taste. And as for my Aunt Glad, well, when everything was over and quiet and everybody had cleared away, she went out into the backyard. She took down all those old sheets off of her laundry line. And for some reason, she had kept one of those sheets all these years. But then again, perhaps I know why. Perhaps it was just because Aunt Glad was always up for a good story.